Good evening. My name is Natalia Fedorchuk. I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Departments of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, Italian and Italian Studies, French and Francophone Studies, East Asian Studies, and German, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Translation Invisible. Translation of books from one language to another is an intricate process that requires meticulous evaluation of the work being translated. The thorough nature of this process means that for many authors, translation into another language can be difficult to achieve, hindering the spread of individual or academic perspectives on an international scale. The ability for literature to be passed between countries, languages, and cultures is critical in building global interconnectedness and language skills. It is vital to recognize the perspectives of international authors, academics, and other individuals published in literature to create an overarching diversity within literature, especially as global interconnectedness evolves within international relations. The supported growth of multilingualism within global communities allows for the development of multi-language interaction opportunities, and the publishing industry has a significant influence in the growth and spread of these integral multilingual experiences. As someone who speaks English as a second language, I recognize the importance of language diversity in my own life and how it has influenced my ability to connect with others both inside and outside of an academic context. Multilingualism has contributed to the development of both who I am as a person and who I am as a student, allowing me to view the world in a more dynamic way and interact with peers from other international backgrounds more assuredly. It is through the space that my immigrant status has created that opportunities to learn new languages has emerged. Without this space, I would have lost an integral part of my identity and development, and so I recognize that maintaining and fostering of this space in an academic and societal setting is imperative. Our speaker tonight, Regina Galasso, is an associate professor in Spanish and Portuguese Studies, as well as the director of the Translation Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her talk tonight will discuss literary translation, focusing on the intersection of English and Spanish in the United States. Her work as author of Translating New York, the city's languages and Iberian literatures received the 2017 Northeast Modern Language Association Book Award, and her work co-editing Avenues of Translation, the City in Iberian and Latin American Writing received the 2020 South Atlantic Modern Language Book Association Award. Since 2018, Professor Regina Galasso has worked with public schools throughout the state of Massachusetts to create opportunities for educational and professional development for interpreters and translators in the public schooling system. Her appointment to the School Interpreters Task Force from 2018 to 2019 by the Commissioner of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has allowed her to focus her work on the improvement of Massachusetts public school translation and interpreting language access initiatives, forming opportunities for teachers and staff to find and create this integral space for building skills to grow a strong multilingual society and education system. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Professor Regina Galasso.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, Natalia. It's such an honor to be part of this series. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Oh. Okay. So I would also like to thank Mark Aldrich for this invitation, and Sarah Markowitz and Kim Flitchbaugh at the Clark Forum for helping to make this virtual visit possible in this time of transition into a period that might look something more like how we lived before March 2020, and that incorporates what we have learned during the past year and a half. I am grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. Welcome. Putting together this presentation for an audience of undergraduate students and faculty from Dickinson College, members of the local community, as well as students and faculty from other institutions, allowed me to bring together the work I do in my several roles. This evening, in my presentation titled Translation Invisible, I will be drawing from my experience as an educator, researcher, and writer, translator, and director of the Translation Center at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. In my presentation, I will be moving between the ways in which translation is invisible, either because it is not recognized or because it is simply not done. It just doesn't happen, and how making translation invisible, making translation visible, can shift ways of thinking about language and translation and the relationship to diversity, equity, and inclusion. What I'm presenting here are episodes in the invisible life of translation, and you can hear that however you want to. So if I may, I would like to begin by briefly telling you about the Translation Center at UMass Amherst, for those of you who might not know about us yet. The Translation Center is a unique kind of center to have at a university, and it's really worth talking about because it greatly impacts the lives of students and the community. And the work that I have been doing as the director of the center since September 2017 has greatly influenced how I have spent the last few years of my life and my work in general. The Translation Center was founded in 1979 by two professors of comparative literature at UMass Amherst, Warren Anderson and Daniel Martin. An article titled "Bridging the Gaps of Language," published in a local newspaper in May 1979, says, "The Five College area is a harbor filled with multilingual persons. The UMass Translation Center intends to make these individuals available to the community. The center will function as a clearinghouse for translators." The Translation Center started as a place that would have local professors from UMass Amherst, Amherst College, Hampshire College, Mount Holyoke College, and Smith College translate documents and serve as interpreters during meetings and appointments for the local community. Gradually, the UMass Translation Center expanded with the transformations implemented during the directorship of Edwin Gensler, Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature and he was director from 1994 to 2014. During those 20 years, the Translation Center expanded its services to offer a full range of translation and interpretation services to businesses, schools, government agencies, social service organizations, museums, private individuals, and more. Those services include translation, interpretation, transcription, subtitling, dubbing, workshops, consulting, and much more. During those 20 years, the Translation Center also built its capacity to offer services in up to 80 languages. And this is part of what we still do today. Our clients and partners come from near and far, and I would say that we can provide our services in any language if the timeline allows. The University of Massachusetts Amherst is a research institution, and if a request for services in a language we do not usually work with comes our way, we know how to find a capable language expert because we are connected to scholarship, professional organizations, a network of translators, and an international community. Because we are a university offering these services to the public, many people think our services are done by students. Let me tell you about the people who make up the Translation Center team. Each project that we're hired to do is managed by one of our managers, or by one of our project managers of the center or the assistant director. And all of these people are UMass Amherst employees, not students. We hire UMass undergraduate and graduate students to work with our project managers on specific assignments, and occasionally they participate in the translation process as translators or reviewers. This depends on their languages, their language skills, and their experience with translation. They work with me and the assistant director on special projects, and thanks to their time with us, students gain valuable professional experience and develop an awareness of responsible language use that they will have with them forever to influence their professional and intellectual lives. We work with translators who can provide professional level translations and other language experts to provide our services. And in most cases, students do not yet have that level of expertise. Another question we usually have to answer at the Translation Center is about pricing. Money is a big topic when it comes to translation, since to do it right is usually more expensive than people think it will be. Since people who come to work with us for the first time often have the impression that students are doing the work, they think there's no charge for it. There is a charge for our services. It was decided long ago that the Translation Center needed to charge for its services in order to help organizations budget for them, so that thinking about providing translations would be a systematic part of an organization. Translation services are costly, and organizations do need to prepare for them. The Translation Center has also stood behind the idea that translators and other language professionals need to be compensated for their work. What makes the Translation Center different than a language service provider on Main Street is that we use the proceeds to support teaching, research, and translation-related activities organized by faculty and students. We are committed to bringing awareness to issues of language, including access, equity, and inclusion through educational initiatives and outreach. And the proceeds go to support those initiatives and outreach work. So I would like to share with you an example of a recent project. Since March 2020, I have been leading a partnership between the UMass Amherst Translation Center and the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Part of our work together is to provide a workshop series to develop the translation skills and the interpreting skills of bilingual school staff who provide these services in their schools, and to develop a stronger awareness of the importance of language access. So to help welcome the 2021-2022 school year, the Translation Center created this poster in collaboration with educators, translators, researchers, designers, and students, and this poster was sent to schools. So I want to read to you what it says at the bottom of the poster. These are the 86 languages spoken by families with children attending schools according to over 20 districts throughout the state of Massachusetts. Many of these families are learning English and need support in their preferred language so that they have access to their children's education and the school community. Providing access to school communications in languages other than English is a complex, fascinating, and ongoing responsibility. It involves the collaboration of district and school leaders, teachers, staff, families, community members, trained translators and interpreters, and other professionals. In an effort to join schools in welcoming families, the Translation Center has worked with translators to provide welcome in 86 languages. We present the translations as they were given to us, so capitalization and punctuation differ across languages. This poster serves as a reminder of the linguistic and cultural diversity of the school communities throughout the state. Helping families get the information they need in a language they can fully understand is not only about compliance, but also the right thing to do to help our children succeed. If a language represented in your school is not listed, please let us know at translate@umass.edu. And then one other thing I want to note about the poster is the asterisk. Then we had to put one on a few of the languages, and here's why. We could not offer a translation verified by a human for this language. We include it here as a way to show that the work of language access is an enduring process that relies on many resources coming together to be successful. So we made 24 by 36 color prints of this poster and sent them to the Massachusetts districts that have participated in the Interpreter and Translator in Education workshop series that the Translation Center offers. And we received excellent feedback that we didn't anticipate on how the poster is being received in the communities. And one district ordered one poster for each of its school buildings and made a donation to the Translation Center in order to get them. So some of the anticipated feedback came in the form of what some other districts reported, that this poster helps families identify their language when entering a school building and allows for a welcoming environment, which encourages the request for language services. So families, if they're not or are having trouble communicating orally with schools, they can point to their languages on the poster. So it has become a language access tool. And here you have a close-up of what the boxes look like. And another thing about this poster is that it gives everyone in the school community access to language. And what do I mean by that? The school community gets to see languages they might not know yet. They get to see these languages other people in their community speak. They get to imagine the words of those, or the worlds of those languages, develop questions about them, and maybe be inspired to learn at least one of those languages. So if anyone is interested, we have a digital version of the poster available to everyone on our website. And if you're interested in a print copy, you can see on the website how to get one. And I also want to mention that now we have a work study student who is getting audio files to all the welcomes in the 86 languages. And we plan to link them to the poster on our website. And we did one other poster to date, which is our Celebrate poster. In celebration of International Translation Day, September 30th of this year, the Translation Center asked select school districts, what do you want your school community to know about translators and interpreters or their work in Massachusetts schools? The Celebrate poster shares their responses, and here you have a response from Lorenzo Garcia, the Assistant Superintendent at Revere Public Schools. And Lorenzo says, interpreters ensure that reliable and meaningful communication permeates the cultural fabric of schools to close opportunity gaps for multilingual students and families. They help dismantle systems that have historically perpetuated unjust practices and inequities for immigrant children and their families in order to build a more sustainable and inclusive world. So it is important and we create these things because it's important for all families to be aware of the fact that some families rely on language access. because in order for this to work in schools, everyone needs to be on board. And soon, if you're interested, you can view this poster on the Translation Center's website, or find it on our Facebook page, or on my own LinkedIn account. So these are some of the ways we use proceeds to make translation and language more visible. And I am grateful that we have the time and the space to do these projects with our students and professionals, because we all learn from them. And, I wanted to show you this because we are currently exploring ways to support the unplanned for translation needs that arise in our community and beyond. And one avenue we are exploring is to do this through donations to the Translation Center that would be reserved to cover translation services for immigrants and refugees. And so the services for them would be free of charge, and the donations would compensate the translator or interpreter depending on the services in need at the regular rate. Our website is always available to accept gifts, but establishing a more visible way to give to this particular cause might be more effective. And we hope to have this ready soon, because the need for information in Pashto and Dari is rapidly increasing as we welcome families from Afghanistan. So I hope you're thinking that after hearing all about the Translation Center, and there's so much more to say, that translation is visible. It is visible to certain members of the UMass Amherst community and others, but there is a lot of work to be done in order to make translation visible to the general public. So for translators and other scholars who study translation, thinking about translation being invisible is a daily question. Last March 23rd, you had the translation theorist and historian and translator of humanistic texts, Professor Emeritus Lawrence Venuti, virtually visit the Clark Forum. One of his books, The Translator's Invisibility, A History of Translation, you might have heard of it, was first published in 1995 and revised and published in 2008. Then in 2017, Routledge printed the text again as part of their Translation Classics series. So this book has provoked debate and controversy within the field of translation, with a focus on literary translation, especially in the Anglophone world. In other words, in the world of translations into English. In the Translator's Invisibility, Venuti traces the history of translation from the 17th century and shows how fluency, or how making the language of a translation comfortable for the reader of the translation, has dominated the Anglophone context. This strategy purposely erases traces of foreignness. He argues that dominant notions of readability do not allow for experimental types of translation, which might stray from the current standard of dialect and other characteristics, introducing foreign elements into a text for greater impact in the receiving culture and language. Because of the translator's necessity to follow legal, sometimes a contract for a book translation requires the translator to make a faithful rendition. So because of these legal and cultural constraints, translators, Venuti argues, are invisible. So 25 years later, while there have been advances in practices to allow for a greater range of things to happen in translated texts, Venuti continues to be interested in promoting a deeper vision of fundamental ideas of translation, as was demonstrated in the very talk he gave here at the Clark Forum. What is translation? Theory, practice, value. So the answer to this question is not straightforward. And here I quote Venuti from the interview he did with Nolan Court, the Clark Forum student project manager, during that March 2021 virtual visit. What translation is something that varies, not simply historically from one period to another, but also within the same period, depending on different readerships. Different readerships, as well as different periods, will look at translation to do different things, and will find it important or valuable for different reasons. So the multiple levels of the answer remind us of the complexities of translation. There will continue to be conversations about what translation is, and even more so until there is a widespread recognition about translation and that translators choose every word of a translation. And we're getting there, at least with some audiences. So in this past Saturday's issue of The New Yorker, in her article titled, "The Book That Taught Me What Translation Was," Jhumpa Lahiri writes about her recent English translation, Trust, of Domenico Starnoni's novel. She says, "To write, first and foremost, is to choose the words to tell a story, whereas to translate is to evaluate acutely each word an author chooses. Repetitions in particular rise instantly to the surface, and they give the translator particular pause when there is more than one way to translate a particular word. On the one hand, why not repeat a word the author has deliberately repeated? On the other hand, was the repetition deliberate? Regardless of the author's intentions, the translator's other ear in the other language opens the floodgates to other solutions. Some of the questions a translator faces in the process of translation become visible. So let's cross the Atlantic Ocean. Meet Javier Calvo, a novelist and Spanish language translator of US literature, including the novels of David Foster Wallace, Joan Didion, Salman Rushdie, and Zadie Smith, among others. In 2016, Calvo published the book El Fantasma en el Libro, La Vida en un Mundo de Traducciones in Barcelona. The quick English translation of the title could be Ghost in the Book, Life in a World of Translations. The translator as a ghost is a form of being invisible. In El Fantasma en el Libro, Calvo discusses how we live in a world of translations. Translations are everywhere, yet the profession, job, craft of the translator is invisible. His book profiles the professional literary translator while sharing anecdotes from the world of translation. The circumstances, and he also talks about the circumstances that influence how translation is done and the history of translation. It is really a must read for those of you who read Spanish, and it's not yet available in English in its entirety. But there is a section that has been translated into English by the literary translator Marifé Leatham, and it was published in the fall 2018 issue of the Massachusetts Review, a quarterly of literature, the arts, and public affairs. And the Massachusetts Review is housed at UMass Amherst, and the executive editor is a UMass Amherst faculty member, Jim Hicks. So it's curious to note, too, that Calvo, one of the best literary translators in Spain, is invisible as a translator on Wikipedia. The page dedicated to him in English just calls him a Spanish writer born in Barcelona in 1973. There's no mention of him as a translator or of his translations. The page dedicated to him in Spanish does mention that he is a translator, es un escritor y traductor literario español, but does not list any of his translations. Of course, we know that we need to look beyond Wikipedia to a trusted source, But what's unfortunate is that many internet users do not go beyond Wikipedia. So although, as I mentioned earlier, translators carefully choose every single word that goes into their translation of a book, are translators' names always on the cover of the books they translate? No. Another reason why a cover is not the book. For years, literary translators have been advocating for themselves to make sure their names were on the cover of the books. Sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. This is another example of translation moving between the invisible and the invisible. This past September 30th, in celebration of International Translation Day, a group of translators, writers, and publishers asked publishers to put translators' names on the cover of the books they translate. Jennifer Croft and Mark Haddon write in that open letter, "It is thanks to translators that we have access to world literatures past and present. It is thanks to translators that we are not merely isolated islands of readers and writers talking amongst ourselves, hearing only ourselves." A month earlier, on August 31st, Jennifer Croft, who among other publications is known for her International Booker Prize winning translation of Olga Tokarczuk's Flights, shared on Twitter, "I'm not translating any more books without my name on the cover. Not only is it disrespectful to me, but it is also a disservice to the reader, who should know who chose the words they're going to read." And here are some of the snapshots of the articles published online about this action. But besides giving credit to the translator, why else should readers care about the name of the translator on the cover of a book? So if you're interested in reading an English translation of literary classic Madame Bovary, translated from the French, if you're just grabbing any edition without care for who translated it, you might find yourself reading the 1886 Eleanor Marx Aveling translation or the 2011 Lydia Davis translation. Two very different experiences that might determine if you continue reading this literary classic or not. I mean, it all depends what you're looking for, right? 19th century English or English from 2011. So if you would like to support this effort, you can use the hashtag here, translators on the cover, and you could also go to authorsguild.org to sign the open letter to support this movement. I do want to mention, though, that not all translators actively seek the same visibility. Elliot Weinberger, the US writer and translator of Spanish language authors, including the Mexican writer Octavio Paz, says that the translator's anonymity is the joy of translation. One is operating on the level of language, attempting to invent similar effects to capture the essential without the interference of the otherwise all-consuming ego. I encourage you to read his essay, Anonymous Sources on Translators and Translations, and it's in the 2013 volume, In Translation, Translators on Their Work and What It Means, edited by Esther Allen and Susan Bernofsky. So now I would like to step away from these examples and look at the bigger picture. So what are some of the factors that contribute to translation invisible? The last time I checked, there are no academic departments of translation and interpretation at US universities and colleges. And this is not the case in other countries. The Department of Translation and Interpretation at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona is over 40 years old. And last time I checked, Kent State University is the only institution in the US to offer an undergraduate degree in translation through the university's Institute of Applied Linguistics. And it is a Bachelor of Science degree. A Bachelor of Arts degree in translation might look a bit different. There are some universities which nestle translation tracks in a bachelor degree in Spanish, for example. And the University of Arizona does this with a practical focus on the healthcare and legal fields. But a track within a major does not grant the same visibility as majoring directly in the subject. At the graduate level, things look a little bit different. There are MA programs in translation and PhD programs in translation studies. Check out Kent State, Binghamton University, the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, Rutgers University, New York University. There are some others. The University of Iowa has an MA program in literary translation, and at UMass Amherst, the Comparative Literature program offers an MA track in translation and interpreting studies. In the Spanish and Portuguese Studies program, thanks to my colleague and fellow translator, Professor Tal Goldfein, we offer an academic area in translation in the Hispanic and Lusophone world. And an area means that throughout the students' time in our program, we provide ways to help them specialize through coursework, qualifying exams, publications, teaching assignments, and other professional activities. And in this area, as our website says, we explore the fundamental role of translation and translators in the construction of cultures and identities in the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking worlds, including Iberia, Latin America, Africa, and the United States. We are interested in the multiple ways in which the activity of translation offers a rich field for the study of how literatures and languages are constituted, of how cultures interact, and of how collective memories and identities are constructed in the Hispanic and Lusophone worlds. And then in the United States too, there are also certificate programs, minors and concentrations, and individual courses that focus on translation. But at the moment, there is nothing quite significant as a department of translation and interpretation. And this absence contributes to the visibility or lack of visibility of translation and what it is and how it helps us grow as a society and as individuals. And why translation needs to be part of larger conversations if we don't want to exclude anyone based on their language needs. So another factor that contributes to translations in visibility or blurred visibility is that the general public does not always understand that being bilingual does not make someone a translator or an interpreter. It is important to recognize that many times when a bilingual person is asked to act as an interpreter or to translate a word or a phrase or a document, that can be rather stressful. Interpreting and translation are not automatic. Interpreting and translation are skills. They are two different skills. I want to go over the skills of the translation skills to make visible what it is that a trained professional or experienced translator does. And this is important for this audience because you might, with all good intentions, but without knowing it, might ask bilinguals to do translation work in the workplace. And some of you might go on to be bilinguals in a workplace. And if your main job is not to be a translator or to provide translations, you might want to think about how to address that with your employer if you're asked to do one. So let's go over translation skills for translators in general. First, translators need to be bilingual and bicultural. They need advanced language knowledge of the languages they work with and about language in general. They need excellent written skills. They need to have strong command of the use of words. Translators need to make sure that the accuracy does not get lost in the expression. And usually it's formal education and experience in the languages they work with that will improve their writing skills. They need to pay attention to detail. Translators need to be accurate and thorough. They need to prioritize accuracy over speed and quality over quantity. They also need to have research skills to look up the things they do not know or are not 100% sure of. You can't accurately translate a text if you don't fully understand it. They need typing and technical skills. How do you put accent marks on the computer? I have some students who have beautiful Spanish, but they don't know how to put accent marks in their papers. And then, then what happens to that beautiful Spanish? As part of the technical skills, they need to know how to format a document in InDesign or any other kind of desktop publishing. Translators also need sound translation, also need to have a sound translation and review process. And that would involve not just grabbing a document and starting to translate it, but carefully reading it, analyzing it, and identifying what issues might come up during the translation process. Not only does there need to be a process in place to do the translation, but also a methodology for quality control. There is a stereotype that translators are hermits and that they like to work alone, while interpreters are the social butterflies. Of course, as a stereotype, it's not completely true, but one of the skills a translator needs to have is interpersonal skills in order to negotiate deadlines, and they need to know how they might suggest improvements to a source text or the text that they're translating from if they are working with documents that might get released at the same time. Right? A translation is a thorough review of the text you're translating from, and often in the translation process, weaknesses of that source text will be revealed. And finally, just like any other professional, translators need knowledge about their profession, about translation. And that means they need to know what are the terms that are used amongst professionals. So Lawrence Venuti published a book in 2013 called Translation Changes Everything. And this is very important to keep in mind when we translate or talk about translation. I would also add to that, and these are my words, that translation challenges everything. And this is something that the general public is not always aware of. And this is helpful to keep in mind when translating or thinking about translation. Translation challenges your knowledge of the language you're translating from. And translation asks you to use your knowledge of and to be creative in the language you are translating into. This is nothing that is fast and easy. I was listening to Fernando Saraleghi's presentation here at the Clark Forum earlier this semester, and he said that in telling his story, the path showed me the culinary tradition of others and opened my eyes to what I could understand about myself through others. When we translate the words of others, we also get a better sense of who we are, what we prioritize, and what we prefer. Now I would like to bring some visibility to the relationship between a translator's languages. Often translators are asked which language they know best or need to know best, the language they translate from or the language they translate into. The late Gregory Rabassa translated from Spanish and Portuguese into English. He translated many major works of Latin American literature, including Cien Años de Soledad by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude. He was interviewed by a prestigious US publication. The journalist interviewing him said, "Wow, you must know a lot of Spanish in order to translate Garcia Marquez." In Rabas's response, he commented that the journalist had asked him the wrong question. The question should have been, do you know enough English to translate the work? An effective translation demands a translator's fluency and inventiveness in the language he or she is translating into, since the finished project has to be convincing in the language of the translation. There are some translators, mostly translators of literature, who even translate from languages they do not know into, of course, languages they do know. How do they do that? They rely on available resources, fellow translators, previous translations of the text they are translating, and their knowledge of other languages. This makes visible that translations can be, and often are, the results of a complex collaborative effort. I want you to keep in mind, though, that things about translation and directionality are not always that simple. For many of us who live bilingually and who have been living bilingually for many years, we can translate well into both our languages. Determining what we should translate and into which language depends on education, the type of text, and the context. So now I also want to bring visibility to what translators are not. Translators are not dictionaries, or translators should not be treated as bilingual dictionaries. I found this image here years ago on the internet, and I don't even know how I found it, and I saved it on my computer, and I tried to find it again with no luck. So unfortunately, I don't have the source, but if anyone finds it, please let me know. So what do I mean that translators are not bilingual dictionaries? Often friends or strangers in casual conversations, when they find out I translate and teach translation, ask me, "Oh, how do you translate this word or this expression?" I usually always want to help, especially friends and even more so strangers. So I would struggle on the spot to find the translation. One word in, another out. But I could never do it right. And I would feel silly because my translations given on the spot were horrible and could not sufficiently represent the years I have spent studying languages and studying translation. But then when I read Javier Calvo's book that I mentioned earlier, El Fantasma en el Libro, I found his answer to these same questions, and that helped me a lot. Yo siempre les doy la misma respuesta decepcionante. La traducción no funciona así. No hay ninguna palabra que se traduzca siempre por otra. No hay reglas, solamente casos. And my fast, unfinished translation of that is, I always give the same disappointing response. There isn't a word that can always be translated with another. There aren't any rules, only cases, or I don't know, or I don't like that only cases, it might be, or specific situations. But anyway, Calvo reminds us that words live in context, and the context will let you know how to translate a word. He also reminds us that it is difficult to talk about generalizations or to supply general ways of translating words. Every translation that translators are asked to make will depend on many different factors. To do it right, you need all of those factors. So now, I want to say that I do not study bilingualism or bilingual children other than personally spending a lot of time with them. But what I just said about bilingual dictionaries and translations makes me think about situations I have witnessed on more than one occasion when it comes to talking about a bilingual person's language skills. And I want to share this anecdote. One day at a child's birthday party in a mostly English-speaking setting, I heard a mother whose first language was Spanish say in English to her son, "How do you say in Spanish?" I can't recall the word in question because it was the situation itself that was more memorable. When the child did not produce the word in Spanish right away, the mother quickly criticized her son on his lack of knowledge of Spanish to the other adults around and said like he doesn't even know Spanish or something. And it was clear that the boy did know how to come up with a word for her. He searched her face for a few seconds and waited for her to say something more. He hesitated because he did not know in which context his mother wanted to use the word, not because he could not translate this single random word thrown his way. However, when he heard his mother tell the group that he could not do it, he quickly lost interest and continued to play with his friends. So I'm not trying to blame the mother for criticizing her son. It's just an example, I think, of the limited ways we are conditioned in the United States to think about language. A more widespread understanding of translation and language, or how words belong to context, might make individuals more attuned to the complexities of asking for a single word translation and undo ideas about an individual's deficiencies in Spanish and in English or in any language. So now, no talk on translation to a diverse audience would be complete without mentioning Google Translate. Google Translate, on the one hand, has made the word translation visible, but has made the work of translation invisible. As Kleber Palma, the director of the Translation and Interpretation Unit of New York City Public Schools, has said about Google Translate, it devalues the importance, hard work, and professionalism of translators. And end of his quote. Google Translate gives the impression that translation is fast, easy, and cheap to individuals who do not understand how translation works. Google is a search engine. It searches the internet for an existing translation. At best, Google can be useful if you're trying to get the gist of what type of information is contained in a text that is written in a language that has a high presence on the internet. It might occasionally deliver an acceptable translation because it finds on the internet what a human already translated. But it's not always a guarantee. Google Translate doesn't work the same for every language. The results it gives also depend on the search engine, the computer, and the location. Google attempts to translate words, but not meaning. It can't pick up on the connotations of words, and at best, and depending on several factors, it produces content, but not a quality translation that reflects knowledge and creativity. So not all of you in the room are translators. So I'm hoping this will work, but I've come up with this activity for us to do together so that you can experience for a moment what it feels like to be a translator and be compared to Google Translate. So if you still have these things, please take out a piece of paper and a pen or pencil, or if you don't have those things, maybe just imagine you have them. And I would like you to draw a picture of the sentence that you see here. The friends have lunch in the park. And it doesn't need to be anything fancy. And so while you're drawing that or imagining what you would draw, I would like to conclude my presentation. So we've covered examples of what translation is, what translators do, how translating into languages other than English can give people access to other languages if they live in a monolingual community. I encourage you to look out for translations in your bookstores, proactively read literature in translation, use translation as a tool to improve your own writing and to also improve your comprehension of a difficult text. We need translation to have richer lives in all ways. What I need to leave you with is that translation is a necessity for individuals who need information in a language they can't, who need information in a language they can fully understand. In a recent conversation with the former director of the Translation Center, Edwin Gensler, we both recognize that translation is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. We need to tune into the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination against national origin. Are the speakers of all languages in our communities included? Are they getting the messages they need? Are our communities being proactive about supplying quality translation to those who need it? You don't have language access because you link Google Translate to your website or because you only translate your website and nothing else. And a multilingual lawn sign in front of a house letting speakers of other languages know that they are welcome in a community needs to be backed up with services in those languages and services that are not hard to get. So a lawn sign is also not enough. And if we can do more translations, make translations more visible, we can also change our landscape by adding languages to them. And the sight of those languages can be liberating, inspirational, and transformative. So thank you very much. And I guess if I'm wondering, is there a way if I could know if some people have drawn pictures of the friends have lunch in the park? Okay, I think I see some people moving around or putting up a hand. So if you have someone nearby, you could take a look at your neighbor's drawing and compare it to yours, and think about how they're different, how they might be the same. But what I want to point out is, even though this is a very, very simple sentence, right? There's no poetic language, there's nothing fancy about it. You had choices to make, right? You had to think about how are you going to represent the friends? How many friends are there? What do they look like? And what are they having for lunch, right? So you had to kind of interpret lunch. And how did you represent the park? And I'm sure all of you did this in different ways. So now I want to show you my Google Translate drawing of the sentence. And then this, of course, is all an invented activity, right? To give you the feeling of what it's like to be a human translator and face the Google translation of the same text. So here is the drawing from my Google Translate. Oops. Here we go. So it's not natural, right? Yes, we have the friends, but they're all the same. That's not how it works, right? And there's food, there's some food, but who eats something like this for lunch? And where do you get a cupcake that size? maybe this could happen on a special occasion, but nothing in the sentence indicated that this was a special occasion for which we would get this cupcake that's half the size of the body, right? So how do you feel when someone says, let's use this drawing instead of yours? So like all of these feelings that you might have regarding this machine drawing with respect to your own is how translators feel most of the time when it comes to Google Translate products. So I thank you for participating if you participated, and thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing what questions or comments you might have.
This begins the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait for the microphone to reach you before you ask your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Thank you so much for this presentation. My question, I'm not sure if there's going to be a simple answer to it, but I was wondering what qualifications are needed to become a translator and/or interpreter. I've heard of like national certifications for interpreters, but I didn't know if there was something similar for translators and if it varies between literary or scientific translations.
Thanks. Yes, that's a very good question, and something that's a mystery to most people. In general, in the U.S., because we don't have departments of translation and interpretation, and because there's just this kind of general lack of knowledge of how it works, there are different paths to becoming a translator, and one of them could be, of course, intentional, where you want to be a translator, you take courses, you do certificate programs, you keep practicing, and you just kind of get really good at it and convince people that they can pay you to do it. But then there's also, for translators, the American Translators Association, and an exam that could certify you to be a translator. I'm not sure if it's available in all languages just yet, but you could have ATA certification, and that would certainly be a credential, but not every place that would hire you would necessarily require that. Some places might, but it's not something that all places would. So it depends really on your experience, your resume, and your skills. To be a literary translator, there are no certifications with that. Once again, it's just doing a really good job and having someone like your work and publish it. So those, yeah, I don't know if I'm forgetting something, but and sometimes too, at certain agencies or places that might hire you, there might be like a translation test that you have to take to get hired. So, they would give you a text and you would translate it and then give it back to them. And then they would hire you based on the evaluation of that translation. And that's kind of a best practice for translation agencies or places that are providing translation to once in a while check in on the quality and assess the quality of their translators' translations.
Hi, my name is Andre. I would like to ask about, is there any kind of job or internship opportunities for the Translation Center?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we hire students for sure. We don't have like a formal internship program. The amount of students we hire kind of depends on what we need at the Translation Center. You know, if there's a need for a certain language, then we might look for a student to help us out. Maybe not as a translator, but someone there just kind of supporting the flow of the translation projects for that language. Like right now in Western Massachusetts, we have families from Afghanistan, and we need, and as you may know, some of those families are coming to the United States because someone in the family is an interpreter. So we're trying to get some university resources or students who know Dari and Pashto to work with us at the center, just to kind of like help the flow of the requests for services in those languages, but not necessarily do them, if that makes sense. So we hire students depending on the needs, and then also depending on just like the workflow and how many students we can responsibly supervise at the Translation Center. There's everyone, not everyone, but many students at UMass want to work at the Translation Center, but we also need to make sure that we can provide them with a meaningful experience. I'm not sure if you yourself are looking for an internship, or if the question was like, do we hire students who are not UMass students, or are you just thinking about UMass students?
Actually, I would really like to contribute my translation skills, because I've been working for the small journalist agency as a translator for about 3 years. But I would like to advance my language skill, not only Korean and English, but also Chinese and Japanese, so that I can provide as much as help to the various institutions.
Oh, wow, that's excellent. Okay, well, you should just be in touch. Send me an email, and we'll see what our needs are and what you might be able to offer. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, I'd just like to say thank you again for the presentation. And I'm wondering, because you talked about Google Translate versus professional translator, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little about the progress of artificial intelligence in translation and how maybe that is being perceived in translation world.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big question. I feel like I spend so much time, advocating for humans to do the work, and how enriching and educational it is for individuals to do the translation work. I'm not too up to date on everything the translation world is saying about artificial intelligence, and also mostly because I translate literature, and I just don't even think we're even some of the products might say one day they will be able to translate literature. I'm just not there, and wanting to even think that that's going to be something that will happen. But it's something that we need to be aware of and incorporate into practices of translations that are not of literary texts with artificial intelligence. I mean, there are machine translation tools other than Google that include translation memory and things like that, and those can work quite well. But you need to know how to use them, and they get stronger based on human translators' participation. So, you know, what I would say about that right now is a human still needs to be part of it. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to follow.
Hello. So this question is also about Google Translate, and I understand that Google Translate has certain limits when it comes to doing translation work. But since it's very popular and is easily accessed, do you think we should use Google Translate as a tool for learning languages? And if yes, to what extent?
I think my first and immediate response is no. No, I don't think you should use Google Translate to learn languages. I think it's just one of many tools you can use, and I think in the toolbox you need to have many different tools, right? So I guess depending on where you're at with learning a language, I mean, you know, reading the language, listening to the language are like the first places I would go to. And, you know, you can only really work with Google Translate if you understand. Google Translate, I think, can only at best be an effective tool if you already know the languages you're working with, and you would use it. Why? I mean, we mentioned before my work with schools. Some schools, yes, they're using Google Translate because, well, it comes across as being free, but it's not free. I mean, you don't have to pay, but you're also letting Google use whatever information you put into it. So, you know, there are some translators who say, well, you know, let's just not use it at all because you're using it and you're making it a stronger tool that, you know, that might one day erase human translators. So it comes across as free, but there are consequences to it. But to learn languages, no. I mean, Google Translate, there's no guarantees that what it's giving you is right. And you can only know if what it's giving you is right if you then know how to verify what it gives you. And I think if you're trying to learn languages, there are many other ways besides Google that can help you do that. That include just, you know, reading the languages in a trusted source or listening to the languages.
I had a question.
I'm curious, have you been using Google to learn languages?
Yeah, personally, I wouldn't say I use Google to learn languages, but more like it's a tool that I use with others, like dictionaries, for example. Dictionary give me words, and then sometimes I would try to put it in Google Translate to see what the context is, like what it gives me. And then, and yes, like I agree with what you said, that you need to have like a more advanced knowledge of the language to be able to verify what Google Translate does. And I think Google Translate kind of provide like a bare framework to which I can build upon. At least that's what that's what I think. But
Yeah.
But
But that's great. It seems like you have other tools that you're using, and that's key.
Yeah, and also thank you for your answer, because like you said, using Google Translate might make it stronger, and then that would eliminate the need for human translator, and that's something that I haven't thought about. So that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I hope we're like far off from that, but I think I might have in my response also started to say that, I know that some schools do use Google Translate, not necessarily like for every project, but I've often heard that, like report cards or progress reports all need to go out at the same time. And if schools are only doing translations in-house, there's just not enough capacity to release progress reports to English-speaking families and to all the other families who need progress reports in other languages, so that they often then rely on Google Translate to do the translations, because they just can't keep up, but they want to keep the timeliness of the release of the progress reports working on track for everyone. So they use a disclaimer. So I know this is not exactly part of your question, but I think in any professional setting, or if there's an emergency and you have to resort to Google Translate to get an important message out, you have to put a disclaimer and say, this document was translated by Google. If something seems off or awkward, or if you have any questions, call us at this number. And of course, the recommendation is that the schools or any other organization who's using Google Translate has that message already in the languages that it knows it's going to use Google Translate for. So, you're kind of saying, well, this is a tool that we use in an emergency, but we also know we can do better.
Hi, I wanted to say thank you for your talk. It made me think a lot about the limited translation work I've done from Spanish to English and vice versa for an internship I did. Mm-hmm. And like reflecting back based on what you said, when I did these translation works and got feedback from my supervisor, there was not much feedback. She just kind of like made corrections, so to speak, and maybe at best said like awkward wording in certain areas, and then submitted her revision of my translation as like the final product. And so I was just wondering, what is like the customary or perhaps like ideal process of revision? Because for me, I kept thinking like, she's from Spain and I'm Colombian American. I'm 22, she's 30 something. Like our worldviews are completely different, and that shapes our translation. And so I'm just wondering, like in the professional world of translation, what does that revision process look like?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's great. And I love how you point out that yes, that age and national origin and experience impact a translation, and they do. And like one set of things doesn't make one translation better than another. I mean, they do need to, I think, adhere to the conventions of the language and be a document that a reader can trust. But the process of revision, I mean, usually when a translator is done, or done for the moment, or done because they have a due date with the translation, I mean, usually if time allows, first you would read it out loud. Does it make sense? Then maybe give it to someone else who is a native speaker of the language your translation is in, but a native speaker who is a good writer in that language or a good reader in that language, have them take a look at it. There's like looking at the translation for content to make sure the content is accurate, and then there's also a revision or editing just to make sure you have agreement that the grammar is correct, you have all the accent marks in, there are no typos. So those are two different types of reading, right? When one's your time you're reading for accuracy, the other time for typos and things like that. But ideally, like the more eyes you can have on a translation, the better. I think at least two more readers of a translation would help, but it also kind of depends on the timeline. You could have one other reader if you could let the translation sit for a while and go back to it. So as I said in my presentation that Javier Calvo says, no hay reglas, right? There are no rules here, and each situation is going to permit you to do something different. And also what you brought up about Spanish from Spain or from a certain place in Spain. I think you said maybe Colombian Spanish. This is hard in the Spanish-speaking world. I feel like a lot of times organizations are translating because they need to do it. They like finish a document and then they're like, oh, and now we have to translate it. And translation becomes an afterthought. And then there's a rush to get the translation done. So sometimes people already go to a translation agency or to a translator and they're already kind of like upset because now they need to get the translation done. And then when you say like, well, who's the audience, right? Is it like a Puerto Rican audience or Mexican, or who's the audience? And then when they have to deal with like the different varieties of Spanish, that introduces some more questions that need to be considered. And I think that when we're translating into Spanish, if the context permits, it's okay to not try to go into a neutral Spanish, but into a Spanish that celebrates the Spanish of the translator, because why not? And also because that's what's really exciting about speaking Spanish and knowing Spanish in the United States, is that there's a diversity of Spanishes and we can all learn from each other's Spanishes. So, I think if there's a document that is really for a Puerto Rican audience, then yes, we probably want it to be a Puerto Rican Spanish, but we could also like push the limits too, if there are limits or what, depending on the audience and the document. But we could also reveal the fact that the translator might not have been a Puerto Rican, and kind of celebrate the diversity of Spanishes that way through translations. So I think I went a little off track there, but I hope that helped.
Thank you. This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join me in thanking Dr. Galasso.
Thank you.